Thanks very much. Thanks to the organisers, and I think actually this session does flow on very neatly from the last discussion, because it is partly, it has a bearing on the whole question about alternatives to austerity, because, I mean, clearly, I guess we all agree that one of the most shameful things about the dishonest and devastating project of austerity is that it's taking place exactly at the same time as the British establishment has become addicted to foreign interventions in various different parts of the globe, but also a massive amount of spending on the military, on subsidising the arms trade, and continuing to develop weapons of mass destruction to pursue those foreign wars. And it's important that we recognise that. I mean, this is kind of a glib point in one sense, but it's not just a rhetorical point. It's not just a propaganda point to make. That actually, if British foreign policy were to change, if there was a real U-turn in the kind of foreign policy that we're adopting, it would be possible to transfer the kind of resources that would make the current project of cuts and austerity unnecessary completely. The figures, I mean, some of the speakers have already outlined some of them, but they're quite incredible, really. I mean, the bedroom tax would save, apparently, is going to save the same amount of money as stopping the occupation of Afghanistan for just 40 days. The cuts to the NHS, 20 billion are tabled up until 2015. That represents just half the military budget in Britain for 1 year. So you can see how, you know, you could transform, you really could transform the possibilities and the outlook for the kind of society we live in if we tackled the whole question of our addiction, or the ruling class's addiction to war. And in fact, it's also possible to say, if you look at it more globally, in terms of the Western powers, if you look at the amount of money that's been spent in Iraq and Afghanistan by the US, Britain and the other Western powers, that the whole economic crisis itself could well have been averted if the kind of investment into arms and the waste that is spent on the military was actually placed elsewhere. So this is a question that is, as I say, not just something that, you know, a point that lefties make, but actually the whole question of the commitment of the Western powers to these foreign interventions, to the new imperialism, is a crucial structural element. So committed to these foreign wars. I think it's not just something that successive governments have stumbled into. You know, it's not just a sort of trend that was started by Blair and has been kind of casually picked up by the current government. It's actually a central part of what passes for a kind of policy, a strategy for the world in the kind of twilight existence of the British establishment. Clearly, you know, as well, by the way, it's an important part of the argument about inevitability. And it's worth saying this over and over again, and this is the kind of the way in which this debate references to the previous one. I mean, you know, the idea that austerity is inevitable, that austerity is essential, that is necessary, is completely vitiated by these kind of figures and this kind of analysis. But the reason why I think that Britain continues to pursue these policies, first and foremost, is because they, right across the political spectrum, British politicians are completely committed to what they call the special relationship, which is really a kind of serial humiliation. And this bizarre commitment to the special relationship was on display just in the last few days, when it transpires that most of the European governments have actually been spied on and have had their phones tapped by the NSA, by the American special services. It was big news that Merkel and Hollande actually complained about this. Cameron, whose phone it appears has been tapped by the US, he didn't complain. It seems like the line the British are taking is that, well, it wasn't so much that Cameron's phone was being tapped, it was the person on the other end of the phone they were trying to monitor. And this is the kind of craven response we're getting from our people. But essentially, the British ruling class is committed to, I think there's two planks to their austerity era politics. The first is a complete obsession with the financial services, and the second is a continued commitment to militarism and to an aggressive foreign policy. These are the two things the British establishment believes they do kind of reasonably well, and these are the two things around which they want to continue to hang their whole policy project. Basically, banks and tanks is the heart of it. So welcome to their world, really. And just to finish, I mean, that's the kind of rather sinister situation that we face. I think, though, to look on the bright side, one of the most positive things about kind of popular politics over the last 10 or 12 years has been the extent to which the British population has decisively rejected this approach. That time after time now, opinion polls show that the overwhelming majority of people reject foreign interventions, reject this level of military spending, don't believe it should happen, and not just for economic reasons, actually, because if you look at the polls in detail, what they show is that people believe that Britain should have rejected its colonial project many decades ago, that really this isn't the kind of operation that we should be pursuing around the globe. So that's the positive thing, and I think what's crucial for the movement generally is that we continue our opposition to the kind of desperately dangerous foreign policy British governments have been pursuing. We had a fantastic success over Syria. Mass protest, public opinion actually did defeat the government on a central project of its policy. And that's important in general terms. It's important because these wars are devastating, they cause misery and mayhem and destruction around the globe. It's important as well that this issue remains central to the movement for strategic reasons, because it's one of the ways that we can, by continuing to focus on the foreign wars, that we can actually continue to defeat the government, confront them on one of their weakest points. We can defeat the government, and actually it's one of the ways we can move forward to break the backward-looking and bankrupt British establishment. Thank you. I'd like to endorse the idea of there being an anti-war element on November the 5th, definitely. Also, just to flag up, by the way, in terms of activity, that Stop the War is organising an international anti-war conference to discuss all of the kind of things we've been discussing in this session and more on November the 30th, which will see activists from around the world coming to London to discuss how to continue the campaign against foreign wars. So, you know, it would be great if we could endorse that as well. Just 3 quick points from the discussion. The first one is about the why Britain, the special relationship discussion. I think Kate and Jeremy are absolutely right to talk about the legacy of Britain's glorious imperial past and how that remains a kind of pipe dream that they're desperately trying to cling on to. It has also a material basis which is a result of that colonial past in the present, which is that Britain has more foreign direct investment than any other European country, and Britain also has more direct investment into the US than any European country. And so the idea is that the establishment believes that Britain should should position itself as a kind of bridge between Europe and the United States. And this is, in a way, one of the preconditions for the other part of British overall policy that I talked about, which is to maintain its position as the main financial centre in the Western world. So I think all those elements come together in what is still, nevertheless, a desperate kind of fantasy policy that continues to be pursued. But it's the best that they have on offer, unfortunately. Second point is just about the state of play with the kind of continuation of US imperialism, and where the whole, both the economic crisis and the Syria debacle has left them. Because I don't think it's tenable or advisable to say simply, you know, there's a problem, the US has to cut its public spending, therefore it's less likely to pursue foreign wars. I think the relationship between the economic crisis and imperialism is actually much more complicated than that. After all, it is the case that both in the US and in Britain, the President and the Prime Minister, they wanted to go for Syria. It wasn't the case that Obama was like backing off because he decided it wasn't such a good idea or he couldn't afford it. He backed off because the British Parliament voted against it, and he was worried that the US Congress was going to vote against it, which would have been a humiliation, an utter humiliation for the world's biggest superpower. So the background to the situation is actually that clearly there is a growing economic crisis in the US. It is also the case that the US has overwhelming military preponderance. I mean, the US has more guns and more weapons than the 10 countries beneath it on the league table of militarization. Therefore, in a certain sense, in a situation where it's economically more and more challenged, there is a growing temptation on its part to pursue the military option, because in some ways it's the only option it's got. And so no surprises that days after he says, we've given up on the US empire, there's a special forces operation in Somalia, there's a special forces operation in Libya, and that actually the level of US forces in Africa is growing on a month-by-month basis at the moment. So I don't think we should believe that, you know, they've given up the ghost, they're going to start worrying about their domestic economy and not worry about these foreign wars. Very last point on protest. I mean, you know, when it comes to the whole question of how we stop the war in Syria, I think the important thing is not this or that tactic, but that actually what happened there was a kind of weird moment when the accumulation of all the protests and all the public meetings and all the demos and pickets and so forth that have been taking place over the last 12 years, combined with the fact that, oh my God, stop the war is still in the streets, to create a situation where suddenly that accumulation meant that the British ruling class lost their nerve, or at least the parliamentary representatives of the British ruling class found that they couldn't push this policy through anymore. So I don't think it was just the protest on the Wednesday night, although that was important, but it was the whole experience of the humiliation of Blair by the anti-war movement, the fact that it created such a crisis for the British establishment over years that meant that they couldn't pursue it. And that's very important, because the main thing we should say about that experience was it proves, despite the propaganda, despite all the people that say A to B marches don't change anything, the reality is protest works. In the right circumstances and pursued with enough vigour and consistency, protest can actually stop the government in one of its core areas of policy. And I think that is a very, very important lesson we have to trumpet from this meeting, from meeting after meeting in the current period, because what we need to say is, if we can stop them over Syria, in the end of the day, if we keep fighting, we can stop them over austerity. Thank you.